Picture this. It's 1887, the Montana Territory. Winter has arrived early, and it's brutal. The kind of cold that doesn't just chill you, it threatens you. The kind of cold that turns your breath into clouds of ice crystals before it even leaves your mouth. Where the wind doesn't just blow, it cuts, like an invisible knife slicing through anything foolish enough to stand in its way. And in a remote mining camp, tucked between frozen mountains and endless white plains, a group of prospectors are preparing for what they know will be the fight of their lives. Not a fight against other men, not a fight over gold claims or water rights, a fight against winter itself. Now, these weren't city folk. These were hardened men, experienced frontiersmen who had survived previous winters, who knew the wilderness, who understood that out here. Nature doesn't negotiate. You either respect it, prepare for it, or you die. And so they did what generations before them had done, what every sensible person believed was the only way to survive a frontier winter. They built log cabins, massive ones, with walls so thick you'd need an axe just to drive a nail through them. They felled the straightest, strongest pines they could find, trees that had stood for decades, some for over a century. They stripped the bark, notched the ends with practiced precision, and stacked those logs higher and higher until they had structures that looked, well, they looked absolutely indestructible. These cabins weren't just shelters. They were fortresses, monuments to human determination. Each one represented weeks of back-breaking labor, hundreds of trees cut and hauled, thousands of axe swings, gallons of sweat even in freezing temperatures. Inside, they installed the biggest cast-iron stoves they could afford or carry. Chimneys made of river stone and clay, built to handle roaring fires that would burn continuously from October through April. They chinked the gaps between logs with moss, clay, and sometimes strips of cloth. They built raised wooden floors to keep themselves off the frozen ground. They installed double doors in some cases, creating small airlocks. Everything they did followed the same basic philosophy, the same unquestioned wisdom that had guided frontier survival for generations. Bigger is better. Heavier is safer. More wood means more warmth. Thick walls equal survival. And then he arrived. Nobody knew much about him. He wasn't particularly tall, wasn't particularly loud, didn't drink with the others in the evenings or join in the card games. He kept to himself mostly, which on the frontier could mean one of two things. Either you were hiding something, or you were the type who preferred your own company. He showed up in late September with a pack mule, some basic tools, and several bundles of canvas wrapped in oilcloth. Canvas. Not timber, not logs ready to be assembled into a cabin, not even the materials to build a proper shelter. Just canvas. And some other odd materials the others couldn't quite identify from a distance. The prospectors watched him with a mixture of curiosity and amusement as he selected his spot. Not one of the prime locations near the creek where water access was easy. Not up on the ridge where the wind was slightly less severe. He chose a small clearing on the eastern edge of camp, slightly elevated, with a few scattered rocks and decent drainage. And then he started working. Now, here's where you need to understand the social dynamics of a frontier camp. These places weren't just work sites. They were communities, tight-knit groups where your survival often depended on your neighbors. where helping someone raise a cabin wall today meant they'd help you tomorrow, where shared knowledge kept everyone alive. So when this newcomer started doing something different, people noticed, and they talked. At first, they thought maybe he was building a temporary shelter, something to live in while he constructed his real cabin. That made sense. Plenty of people did that. But days passed, then a week, then 2 weeks, and he just kept working on his tent. If you want to hear the full story of how this impossible design actually worked and why modern science has proven he was right all along, stick around. And hey, if you're enjoying this deep dive into forgotten frontier engineering, do me a favor and hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more stories about brilliant people history almost forgot. It really helps the channel grow. All right, back to our mystery prospector. So what exactly was this man building that had everyone so confused? From a distance, it looked like chaos. He had spread out multiple layers of canvas, and he wasn't just draping them over a frame like a normal tent. He was stitching them together with some kind of pattern, creating something that looked almost like a quilt, but with different materials. The base layer appeared to be heavy sailcloth or wagon canvas, thick, durable stuff. But then he had layers of what looked like lighter cotton canvas. And between some of these layers, he was stuffing something. The prospectors who got close enough reported seeing him gathering dried moss in enormous quantities, stripping bark from fallen trees, even collecting dried grass and packing it carefully. "What's he doing?" they asked each other. "Building an igloo out of cloth," someone joked. "Sewing himself a burial shroud," another added with a laugh. But he didn't seem bothered by their comments. He worked methodically, carefully, with the precision of someone who had done this before. Or at least, someone who had planned every single step in advance. He constructed a frame, but not from the heavy timber you'd expect. Instead, he used flexible poles, young saplings that he carefully bent and lashed together. The frame created a shape that was unusual, somewhere between a traditional tent and a rounded hut. Not the tall, peaked military tents people were used to seeing. This was lower, more dome-like, with a gentler slope to its walls. Then came the layers. First, he wrapped the frame in that heavy outer canvas. But here's where it got interesting. He didn't just tie it down and call it done. He left a gap, an airspace of several inches between that outer layer and the next layer he would add. Airspace, you might be thinking? Wouldn't that make it colder? That's exactly what the prospectors thought. But they were about to learn something that would challenge everything they believed about insulation. The second layer went up a few days later. This one was lighter canvas, still durable, but not as heavy as the outer shell. And between this layer and the outer one, he carefully packed that dried moss he'd been collecting. Not loosely thrown in, but systematically placed, creating an even blanket of natural insulation all around the structure. Moss, one of nature's best insulators. Dried properly, it traps air in millions of tiny pockets. It's lightweight. It's abundant in most frontier territories. And crucially, it doesn't settle or compress easily like loose grass or straw might. But he wasn't done yet. The innermost layer, This is where his design truly became revolutionary. He used scraps of wool fabric, old blankets that had seen better days, wool clothing that was worn out, even strips of felt-like material that he may have traded for or brought with him. He stitched these together into large panels, creating what amounted to a massive quilted interior wall. Think about that for a moment. 3 distinct layers, each one serving a specific purpose. The outer canvas, weatherproofing, wind protection, moisture barrier. The moss layer, insulation. The air trapped in those millions of tiny pockets acting as a thermal buffer. The inner wool layer, radiant heat reflection and final air sealing. This wasn't a tent. This was an engineered thermal system. Now let's talk about the floor, because this is where most people, even experienced frontiersmen, made a critical mistake. You see, everyone focused on walls and roofs. They understood that cold air came from outside, from the wind, from the open sky. But what many didn't fully appreciate was how much heat you lose through the ground. The earth, especially frozen earth, is like a massive heat sink. It will literally suck the warmth right out of your shelter if you let it. You could have walls 10 feet thick, but if you're sleeping on bare ground or even on wooden planks laid directly on frozen soil, you're going to be cold. Miserably, dangerously cold. Our mysterious prospector understood this. He didn't build a wooden floor. Wood was heavy, required lots of materials, and honestly, it didn't insulate all that well against ground cold. Instead, he created what amounted to a thermal mattress for his entire floor space. First, he laid down a thick bed of dry pine needles and grass, maybe 8 to 10 inches deep. Then, more of that precious moss, packed densely. Then strips of bark laid flat like tiles, overlapping to create a relatively smooth surface. And finally, over all of that, a heavy piece of canvas that he sealed to the edges of his tent walls, creating a continuous, insulated envelope. The result? The cold earth might as well have been a mile away. His floor stayed remarkably warm. Warm enough that he could walk on it barefoot without that shock of cold that made most prospectors keep their boots on even inside their cabins. And then there was the stove. Oh, the stove. This was perhaps the most laughable part of his entire setup, at least to the other prospectors. While they had massive cast-iron beasts, stoves that weighed hundreds of pounds and could burn entire logs at once, his stove was tiny. It was barely larger than a large cooking pot. A small sheet metal contraption that looked like it might have been handmade or salvaged from some other purpose. It had a small firebox, a simple chimney pipe made from rolled tin, and that was about it. That thing couldn't heat a doghouse, one prospector scoffed. But here's what they didn't understand. In a well-insulated space, you don't need a massive stove. In fact, a massive stove is wasteful. It's like using a sledgehammer to drive a finishing nail. Sure, it'll get the job done, but you're expending way more energy than necessary. His tent had approximately maybe 120 square feet of floor space. The ceiling at its highest point was perhaps 7 feet tall, but the sloped walls meant the overall volume was relatively small. Small volume meant less air to heat. Excellent insulation meant that once that air was heated, it stayed heated. His little stove only needed to burn a handful of small sticks to warm the entire space. And once warm, The temperature remained stable for hours with minimal additional fuel. The men in the log cabins, meanwhile, they were feeding massive logs into their stoves every couple of hours. They were burning through their wood piles at an alarming rate. They were working harder, spending more time chopping and hauling, all to maintain a level of comfort that our tent-dwelling prospector achieved with a tenth of the effort. But the real test was yet to come. October passed into November. The temperatures dropped steadily. The first snows arrived, light dustings at first, then heavier falls that blanketed the camp. The prospectors watched the strange tent with increasing curiosity. It was still standing. That was something. They'd half expected it to collapse under the first heavy snow, but the dome-like shape seemed to shed accumulation remarkably well. Snow slid off the sloped sides rather than building up weight on the roof. The man himself seemed fine. Better than fine, actually. While other prospectors emerged from their cabins in the morning, looking haggard, bleary-eyed from interrupted sleep, stiff from the cold, he looked rested. He moved with energy. He didn't have that pinched, exhausted look that came from fighting the cold all night long. Probably just young and hearty, they told themselves. Wait until the real cold hits. And then, in mid-December, the real cold did hit. It came down from the Arctic, a mass of air so frigid that it seemed to have a physical weight to it. The kind of cold where your nostrils freeze shut when you breathe in, where exposed skin begins to hurt within seconds, where moisture in the air crystallizes into tiny ice diamonds that float and sparkle in the weak sunlight. The thermometer. One of the prospectors had brought a proper mercury thermometer, dropped to 20 below 0 Fahrenheit, then 25 below, then 30 below. And it stayed there. For 3 days straight, the temperature never climbed above -25. This was survival weather, the kind of cold that kills. In the log cabins, despite roaring fires that made the stoves glow orange, it was a battle. Frost formed on the inside of the walls. The chinking between logs, which had seemed adequate in autumn, now leaked cold air like a sieve. Men could feel drafts constantly, like cold fingers reaching through the walls. The floors were brutally cold. Even near the stove, even with the fire blazing, the wooden planks remained icy to the touch. Sleeping was miserable. Blankets felt thin and inadequate. Men woke every hour or two to add more wood to the fire, stumbling across the freezing floor, feeding the flames, then huddling back under their covers, trying to recapture what little warmth they'd built up. Water buckets froze solid overnight, even when kept inside. Breath turned to ice crystals in mid-air. The cold was relentless, exhausting, dangerous. And the man in the tent? On the morning of the 4th day, when the temperature finally began to climb back toward merely 0 degrees, a small group of prospectors made their way over to his site. They were genuinely concerned. That little tent, with its flimsy-looking walls and tiny stove, surely couldn't have provided adequate shelter. They expected to find him in bad shape, maybe even frozen. What they found instead left them speechless. As they approached, they saw smoke rising from his small chimney pipe. Just a thin wisp, nothing like the columns of smoke pouring from the cabin chimneys. They called out his name. A moment later, the tent flap opened, and he emerged. And I want you to picture this scene. These men, bundled in every piece of clothing they owned, beards covered in frost, faces pinched and reddened from the cold, exhausted from 3 nights of terrible sleep. And him? He was wearing a single wool shirt, not even fully buttoned. As he stepped out of the tent, a wave of warm air followed him, visible as a cloud of condensation in the frigid morning air. He stretched, smiled at them, and said something like, "Morning, gentlemen. Cold enough for you?" One of the prospectors, a grizzled old-timer named Pete, just stared. Finally, he managed to ask, How cold did it get in there?" The man shrugged. "I'm not sure exactly. Warm enough that I had to crack the vent flap for a while last night. Got too stuffy. Too stuffy. He'd had to let cold air in because he was too warm." Can we see inside?" another prospector asked. "Sure," the man agreed, holding the flap open. One by one they ducked inside, and the warmth hit them like a physical thing. It wasn't just warmer than outside. It was actually genuinely, comfortably warm. The interior of the tent glowed softly from the small stove, which had just a few small pieces of wood burning. The wool-lined walls had a soft, almost luxurious quality. The floor was. They couldn't believe the floor. It was warm under their feet. Not cold, but bearable warm. Actually pleasant warm. Within minutes, they were removing their gloves, unbuttoning their heavy coats. One man sat down on the floor and just laughed. This is warmer than my cabin has been in weeks." They stayed for perhaps 20 minutes, asking questions, examining the construction. The man patiently explained his design, though it was clear that not all of them fully grasped the principles at work. When they finally left, returning to their cold cabins, they had a story to tell. And not just a story. They had experienced something that challenged everything they thought they knew about frontier survival. So let's break down exactly why this tent outperformed the cabin so dramatically. Because this isn't magic. This isn't luck. This is physics and engineering, plain and simple. First, air gaps and insulation. Log cabins, despite their impressive appearance, have a fundamental problem. Logs are wood. Wood is denser than air. And while wood does provide some insulation, it's not nearly as effective as trapped air. The R value, that's the measure of thermal resistance, of solid wood is around 1 per inch. So a log wall that's 6 inches thick has an R value of about 6. But trapped air? Properly trapped dead air has an R value closer to 4 per inch. Our tent builder's design had multiple air gaps between his 3 layers, plus the trapped air within the moss itself. He effectively created an insulation system with an R value somewhere between 15 and 20. More than double what even the thickest log cabin walls could achieve. Second, air leakage. This is huge. Absolutely critical. Log cabins, by their very nature, have gaps. Logs are never perfectly straight. They dry and shrink over time, especially in their first few winters. The chinking between logs. That moss and clay mixture used to seal the gaps. It works okay, but it's never perfect. It cracks. It falls out in places. Animals sometimes pull it out to use for nesting material. Even a small gap, maybe just a 1/4 inch wide and a few feet long, can let in a tremendous amount of cold air. The tent, on the other hand, was essentially airtight. Canvas doesn't shrink. The seams were carefully stitched, and could be sealed with pitch or wax if needed. There were no gaps between logs because there were no logs. The only intentional opening was the door flap and the stovepipe, both of which could be carefully controlled. Third, thermal mass. Now this one is counterintuitive. You might think that the heavy logs of a cabin would store heat and release it slowly, acting as a thermal battery. And to some extent, they do. But here's the problem. Thermal mass works both ways. Those heavy logs absorbed a lot of heat before they warmed up. And in extreme cold, they were constantly losing heat to the outside air. So the stove wasn't just heating the air in the cabin. It was fighting to keep the walls themselves from freezing. The tent had minimal thermal mass, just thin layers of fabric and organic material. This meant that when the stove was lit, the temperature rose quickly. And because of the excellent insulation, it stayed high. The tent responded almost immediately to heat input. The cabins were slow, sluggish, always playing catch-up. Fourth, ground insulation. We talked about this earlier, but it bears repeating. The earth is an infinite heat sink at ground temperature. In winter, that means it's frozen solid, and it will pull heat out of anything in contact with it. Most cabin floors were simply wooden planks laid over frozen ground. Maybe some cabins had a few inches of space underneath, but rarely was this space insulated. The tent had nearly a foot of insulating material between the occupant and the frozen earth. This made an enormous difference in comfort and heat retention. Fifth, volume efficiency. The tent was small. It had less air to heat. The cabins, built for storage and workspaces as well as sleeping, often had 300 to 500 square feet of floor space and 10 or 12 feet of ceiling height. That's a lot of air, a lot of cubic footage that needs to be heated and kept warm. The tent had maybe 120 square feet of floor and an average height of perhaps 6 feet due to the sloped walls. Much less air to heat meant much less fuel needed. Sixth, smart stove placement and heat distribution. In cabins, stoves were often placed against a wall with the chimney going straight up. This meant a lot of the heat went straight up the chimney before it could warm the room. In the tent, the small stove was positioned centrally, and its simple chimney pipe ran through the interior for several feet before exiting. This meant the pipe itself acted as a radiator, warming the air before the heat escaped outside. And finally, wind protection. The dome shape of the tent meant that wind flowed over it smoothly without creating areas of high pressure that could force cold air through seams. The cabins, with their flat walls and sharp corners, created turbulence. Wind hit them hard, found every crack and gap, and exploited these weaknesses mercilessly. Word spread fast. By the new year, several other prospectors had attempted to build similar structures. Most failed, not because the concept was wrong, but because they didn't understand all the details. They might get the multi-layer walls right, but forget about ground insulation. Or they'd insulate the floor well, but leave air gaps in the wall seams. Or they'd use materials that absorbed moisture and lost their insulating properties. One fellow tried to copy the design, but used hay instead of moss for insulation. Within a few weeks, mice had moved into his walls, creating tunnels that destroyed the insulation and let in drafts. He ended up abandoning the tent for a cabin. Another prospector built a tent with the right layers but made it too large. His small stove couldn't heat the volume efficiently, and he ended up just as cold as he'd been in his cabin. But a few got it right. They understood that every detail mattered. The careful sealing of seams, the proper drying of insulation materials before installation, the correct size ratios between living space and stove capacity. The importance of that ground layer. These men survived the winter not just comfortably, but with far less effort than their cabin-dwelling neighbors. They burned less wood. They slept better. They had more energy for actual prospecting work instead of constant survival tasks. The original tent builder became something of a local legend. People called him Warm John or the Tent Man. He gave advice freely to anyone who asked, though he always emphasized that you couldn't just copy the visible parts. You had to understand the principles. It's not about the canvas, he would say. It's about the air. Control the air, and you control the heat. Now, here's what makes this story even more interesting. That prospector, working in the 1880s with no formal engineering training and limited materials, had essentially reinvented principles that modern building science wouldn't fully understand and articulate until nearly a century later. The concept of continuous air barriers. That became a cornerstone of modern building codes in the 1970s and 80s. The importance of ground insulation. Modern building standards now require insulated foundations and vapor barriers. The value of multiple insulation layers with air gaps. That's essentially how modern insulated walls work, whether you're talking about residential construction or high-tech expedition gear. Volume to heat source ratios. Modern tiny houses and van life enthusiasts have rediscovered what this prospector knew. Smaller, well-insulated spaces are easier and more efficient to heat. His tent, as crude as it might have seemed, had an effective R value that would meet or exceed modern building code requirements in many climates. And he achieved this using entirely natural, locally sourced materials and manual labor. So, what can we learn from this story? First, bigger isn't always better. The massive log cabins represented an enormous investment of time, labor, and resources. They looked impressive. They felt substantial. But they were less effective than a structure that weighed perhaps 1/100th as much and took a fraction of the time to build. Second, conventional wisdom isn't always right. Everyone knew that log cabins were the proper way to survive a frontier winter. They'd been used for generations. But conventional wisdom was based on tradition, not on a deep understanding of thermodynamics. Third, understanding beats brute force. The cabin builders were using sheer mass and constant labor to fight the cold. The tent builder used knowledge to work with nature's principles rather than against them. Fourth, sometimes the foolish person is actually the genius. Those prospectors laughed at him. They mocked his strange tent. They predicted his failure. But he knew something they didn't, and he had the confidence to trust his knowledge even when surrounded by skeptics. And finally, this story reminds us that innovation often comes from unexpected places. This wasn't a trained engineer or an academic. This was a prospector, probably largely self-taught, who had paid attention to indigenous building techniques, who had thought carefully about the problem, and who had the skills and determination to execute a solution. The winter of that year eventually passed, as all winters do. Spring came to the Montana Territory. The snow melted. The rivers thawed. and the prospecting season began again. Some of the men went back to their normal routines, rebuilding or improving their cabins for the next winter, but others had learned something valuable. The next fall, there were more insulated tents in the camp. Not many. Most people still clung to traditional methods, but a few, and then a few more the year after that. The original tent builder? Records suggest he moved on after a couple of years, as prospectors often did. Maybe he struck gold somewhere else. Maybe he settled down. Maybe he just disappeared into history like so many frontier characters. But his idea lived on. You can trace elements of his design in Arctic expedition tents, in modern winter camping gear, in the double-wall construction of high-altitude mountaineering tents, in the insulated canvas, structures used by ice fishermen and winter hunters. And somewhere, in old frontier journals and letters, there are probably scattered references to that man with the warm tent. The tent that stayed 45 degrees warmer. The tent that shouldn't have worked. The tent that embarrassed every massive log cabin in the territory. The tent that proved that sometimes, just sometimes, the quiet person working alone with an unusual idea knows something that everyone else has missed. And that's a lesson worth remembering whether you're building a shelter on the frontier, solving an engineering problem, or just trying to find a better way to do something in your own life. Don't assume the biggest, heaviest, most traditional solution is the best solution. Don't mock the person doing things differently until you understand what they're doing and why. And remember that genius often looks foolish right up until the moment it succeeds. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten frontier engineering and the surprising genius of everyday people in history, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this. Drop a comment and let me know, what other examples of unconventional wisdom do you know about? What other times in history did the foolish person turn out to be right? Until next time, stay curious, stay warm, and remember, sometimes the best solutions come wrapped in canvas instead of built from logs.